Welcome to Gary's Halloween Graveyard Gramblings. Hello. This one's going to be a bit difficult, partly because this is take number 3. I've tried to do this about 3 times before and failed miserably every time, so let's hope, fingers crossed, that it works this time. Now, as you can see, I'm in black and white, and I'm in a sombre place. This is the old cemetery in Rye, and a new location, a special location for today, because Halloween is 2 days away. So I'm going to tell you today the strange story of Uncle Jim. I'm not calling this a ghost story because I don't know whether you make your mind up. I'm not going to tell you. No. You have to make your mind up as to what sort of story this is. So I'm going to take you back in this strange story to 1939, because that's when it all starts. 1939. War had just broken out. My mother was 1 year old, and the family lived in a little, brand new for then, semi-detached house in southeast London at a place called Welling. Now, Welling is very close to the old docks at the east end of London, and therefore a prime site for those naughty Germans to come and do terrible things to. So she was kept at home with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. My grandfather, Fred, he went to fight in the war in the Navy, and he was part of the North Atlantic Fleet on HMS Vimy. And I'm very proud of my granddad. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, salt of the earth. His family were all Thames boatmen, mostly, came from Gravesend in Kent, and spent their lives working up and down on the River Thames, which is probably why he went into the Navy. So there is my mother as a baby and my maternal grandmother at home, and next door to them in this, what was then a brand new semi-detached sort of 1930s house, was a very elderly couple called Jim and March. Now, Jim became known as my Uncle Jim, or our Uncle Jim, because my grandfather having been away, by the way, I wasn't there, of course. My mother was only a wee bit. But my Uncle Jim and Auntie March became very, very close as next door neighbours to my nan and to my mum and to her brother, my uncle, who was then just a little boy, who was eventually sent off to the country and evacuated from London, where my mama, as a baby, stayed with my grandmother. Are you with me so far? Right. So, Auntie March and Uncle Jim, they were absolutely the most wonderful, warm, loving people you could ever wish to meet. She was a very elderly, well, not very elderly, I don't suppose she was so elderly back then, but she was a very traditional British lady, a relatively working class lady, I would say. And Uncle Jim was a big man with suit and waistcoat and a watch with a chain, and he was a very, very traditional man, and they absolutely worshipped my mother, who they nicknamed Tilly, and that nickname stuck with her for the rest of her life, actually. Now, we have to forward from that point. So they stuck with them, looked after my grandmother and my mother throughout the war, until my grandfather, thank goodness, came home safely at the end of the war after being demobbed, and they all lived happily ever after next to each other there. Now, I have to zip forward in time, this time to the early 1960s. Now, I'm on the scene as my mum's firstborn child, and we lived in Tunbridge Wells, as many of you who have read my book will know, and we used to go and see my Auntie March and Uncle Jim at their house they had moved to in their retirement years in Rochester, which is a little town on the East Kent coast up in Thanet. It was a very tiny Victorian terraced house, and on a very, very steep hill. That much I do remember. My mother used to have to take us over there on the bus, or a number of buses. God knows how many buses it took to get there. It was quite away from Tunbridge Wells. And there would be me as a toddler and my little brother in his pushchair, probably even my sister in her pushchair at the time. Not sure how many of us there were. This house they lived in there was very traditional, a front parlour, and then a very steep staircase in the middle of the house going to the upstairs parts. And then in the back, there was like a living room or a dining room sort of kitchen area with a big fireplace, and then a step up into the kitchen, which went out to the back of the house, and it had an outside toilet. And we loved going over there. My mum, obviously, because she loved Uncle Jim and Auntie March. They were very, very special to her. And likewise, I loved them. Now, this is where the story gets strange. In the back room above the fireplace, and I always seem to remember there being a roaring fire in this fireplace, there was a big shelf along the top, a mantelpiece above the fireplace. And on the top of it, in the middle, was a big clock. And next to it, a small snowstorm. You know these things you shake? And this snowstorm fascinated me. It was my favourite thing in the whole house. But because of where it was, because it was on the top of the mantelpiece above the fire, I used to have to rely upon Uncle Jim to give me this snowstorm to play with. And I have very, very fond memories of being in that house, playing with the snowstorm, the laughter and the fun and the warmth and the love of both Uncle Jim and Auntie March. Now, we have to go forward probably 25 years to the mid-1970s, I suppose this would be. And this time, we are at my grandmother's house in southeast London, the same one that my mother grew up in, and looking through some old photographs. And I picked out, there was a wonderful picture of Uncle Jim in the box, traditionally dressed just like I always knew him to be, with this wonderful suit and waistcoat and the watch and the chain and this wonderful happy face. And I said to them, I'd not seen this before, so I said to my mum, it's lovely. Oh, look at this wonderful picture of Uncle Jim. And my mum looked at me and she said, how did you know that was Uncle Jim? So I just laughed. I said, what do you mean, how did I know that was Uncle Jim? Of course it's Uncle Jim. No, she said, darling, Uncle Jim died years before you were born. No, Mum, that can't be right. I used to play with him. He was there in the house in Rochester. I used to play. How do you explain me having the snowstorm from the fireplace? Silence. My mother looked a little emotional at that point, so I left it, the story. At this point, it's starting to rain. And I never got to the bottom of that one. Uncle Jim, the man that I loved very much, it turned out, had indeed died many, many years before I was born. And yet I used to play with him at their house. Now, some years later, my mum told me that the only thing that she had from Auntie March and Uncle Jim's house when my Auntie March passed away was a little wicker chair. And she put that in her bedroom in our house in Tunbridge Wells. And she told me once she did actually feel, in a way, that Uncle Jim was with her. So, there we are. The strange tale of Uncle Jim. What do you think? All I can tell you is, every single word I've told you is gospel oak. It is the truth. Uncle Jim was there, and I used to play with him. Now, at this time, I better sign off. The rain is misting down on a Halloween-y type of an eve. And I normally sign off by saying salute, which I will do. But this time I'm going to say salute, and I'm going to doff my cap because this is my granddad's tweed cap. And I loved him very much. Stay safe and watch out for ghoulies this Halloween. Bye.